keeping me company tonight on my programme until 7 o'clock tonight. I've got a new face. We like those, everybody, don't we? Sketch writer and columnist at the Daily Telegraph, Madeline Grant. Good evening to you.
Hello.
And the trade unionist and the broadcaster, and someone who hasn't been moving around all day as though he's a woman, Paul Embery.
Glad you didn't say an old face.
I know, well, I tell you, I think I've done a bit of damage actually to my shoulders when I just practice that shimmy. When you get to my age, you probably shouldn't be shimmying anything, quite frankly. Anyway, look, you know the drill, don't you, on this programme? It's not just about us, it's very much about you guys at home. You can get in touch with me all the usual ways. You can email me gbviews@gbnews.com, or you can tweet me, X me at gbnews. Let's kick off though. Did you see the interview last night, early hours? Of course, I'm talking about Tucker Carlson and Vladimir Putin. Did you watch it? I've got to say, the first half an hour, I had to almost convince myself to stay with it. I was so excited about this interview. I had the popcorn ready. Yeah. And then when I started going back, was it like the 9th century or even earlier that he took us back to? And he says, if you'll indulge me for 30 seconds to a minute, I'll give you a bit of history. Half an hour later, everyone, he was still going. Have you seen that interview yet or not? Anyway, a few key points came out of that. One of the ones that I want to touch on with you guys tonight is what he had to say about our previous Prime Minister, Boris Johnson. Let's just play that, shall we, for those of you that perhaps didn't see it.
Even put his preliminary signature on the document I am telling you about. But then he publicly stated to the whole world, we were ready to sign this document, but Mr. Johnson, then the Prime Minister of Great Britain, came and dissuaded us from doing this, saying it was better to fight Russia. They would give everything needed for us to return what was lost during the clashes with Russia. And we agreed with this proposal. Look, his statement has been published. He said it publicly. Can they return to this or not? The question is, do they want it or not?
Well, there you go. What do you make to that at home? Madeline, your thoughts?
Well, I thought it was fascinating that he tried so hard that Boris Johnson and Britain actually played quite a big part in the interview. You know, it was mentioned a lot. I think it's partly, obviously, I think you have to obviously take anything that Vladimir Putin says with a pinch of salt. And Boris Johnson and Ukraine have both disavowed this story that it was Boris Johnson who put the brakes on a peace deal in Istanbul. But, you know, I think the fact that he is, you know, trying to put the cat amongst the pigeons, as he did when he said, for example, that it was the CIA who blew up the Nord Stream pipeline. That's kind of what you expect. But the fact that Britain played a big role, to me, that's testament to the fact that, you know, we were quite crucial in those early days of the war in kind of keeping the anti-Putin alliance together in the West, making sure that countries like America and Germany especially didn't kind of go soft. So I think that's a testament to the fact that we actually did play quite a big role, particularly in the early days of the war.
And do you think that's a good thing?
Well, I think it was morally right. I mean, Putin is an unambiguous authoritarian leader who's blatantly invaded a neighbour and is also a strategic enemy of Britain's. I don't think this shows an absence of self-interest. I mean, I think we're already seeing, for example, in the Middle East, how if America taking a very soft line on Iran has led to escalation. I think you do sometimes have to put on show your strategic enemies that they can't get away with that kind of aggression.
Paul Embery?
Well, I don't know if we'll ever get to the truth, but I think there is some evidence, actually, that did happen, that Boris Johnson did intervene. And in April 22, there were peace talks going on, and Boris Johnson flew out to Kiev, and shortly after those peace talks came to an end. And the leader of the parliamentary party, Zelensky's own parliamentary party, said at the time, Boris Johnson intervened and scuppered it. So, you know, we can dismiss it as some sort of wild conspiracy theory, or we can say, actually, you know, there is some evidence that there was intervention from Boris Johnson. Of course, he's going to deny it. He would say that, wouldn't he? I think the bigger question is, how do we get to the end of this awful war in which thousands of people have lost their lives? The truth is, one thing Putin said, and I'm no fan of his, but he said, and he was right, it can only come about through a negotiated settlement. At some point, there is going to have to be a negotiated settlement to end this war. And it strikes me that many people in the West are not willing to grasp that, even though it's pretty clear, I think, that Ukraine is not going to win this war. I mean, I have to say that. I'm opposed to the invasion. I'm no fan of Putin. But I think most people recognise now that Ukraine is not going to win this war. So there's two options. You know, we either continue encouraging them to fight, in which case they will probably go down to a slow and very painful and very costly defeat. Or we say, look, we've got to try to help you strike a deal which would be peace, but peace with some honour. And I just don't think that people in the West have grasped that nettle, which then invites you to ask the question, well, why is it that leaders in the West are so obsessed with this particular war, are so focused on this particular war, are so keen for this particular war to continue? For all of their denials that this is a proxy war, I think every intervention that we've seen from leaders of the West, you know, America and Britain and others, shows that we do see it as a proxy war. And I think that's a very sad thing, and has ultimately, I think, prolonged the war and led to thousands of deaths that otherwise wouldn't have happened.
Was there... Oh, sorry.
So do you think that, you know, that Ukraine will simply have to accept handing over a large chunk of its territory to Russia in exchange for peace, and that that's a state of affairs that we should be comfortable with?
Well, we don't know what they would be prepared to accept. We don't know what Putin would demand. I think we have to look at something like the Minsk Accords, for example, which was the basis of some sort of settlement. On the one hand, you know, guarding Ukraine's territorial sovereignty, but at the same time giving a certain amount of autonomy to the ethnic Russians in the Donbass region. And both sides blamed each other for Minsk, you know, not in the end succeeding. But I think if we're serious about peace, then, and I don't think many people in the West are, then you have to be looking at something like that. And the truth is, Madeleine, that wherever there is a conflict over territory, unless one side completely vanquishes the other, there has to be a compromise. We saw that in Northern Ireland. You know, for the same people who are now saying in the West, under no circumstances should we negotiate with Putin, all glorified the Belfast Agreement, where effectively we negotiated with the IRA. And gave them a certain amount of what they wanted. So there's a stinking hypocrisy about this whole "don't negotiate with Putin" thing.
Well, the thing is, I think I agree with a lot of what you've said, and particularly about how, you know, it's difficult for Ukraine to win the war outright. It's also going to be very difficult for Russia to win the war outright. I mean, they've taken severe losses. It's interesting that Putin recently had to act to prevent a anti-war challenger running in the election. They had to come up with some kind of constitutional, legal jiggery-pokery to prevent one of his opponents from running against him. And this guy had just come out of nowhere and had a huge following, basically on an anti-war slate. And there are so many families in Russia who've lost loved ones or can't reach their loved ones. And Russia has always had historic form in treating its civilians and its soldiers like cannon fodder. So, you know, Putin expected it to be very quick and easy to take Ukraine, and that didn't happen either. So I think where we're at is a kind of unpleasant stalemate.
I think one of the things we could offer is you know, neutrality in terms of NATO, because that is Putin's big bugbear. You know, if Ukraine joins NATO, that effectively is the enemy on his doorstep. Now, I think that's probably a price worth paying to say, look, there does probably need to be that buffer zone. In the same way, by the way, that if it was the other way round and a Chinese/Russian military alliance, you know, sent troops in or set up bases in Cuba, as happened in the 1960s, of course, with the old Soviet Union, does anyone doubt that the White House would go absolutely ballistic, no pun intended, absolutely ballistic at that? They would of course say, absolutely no way are we having this military alliance on our doorstep. You know, it's not acceptable. There needs to be some sort of buffer zone. Well, the truth is, whether we like it or not, Putin and the Russians look at Ukraine in a very similar way. You know, NATO was set up explicitly as an anti-Soviet organisation. We know that. So when the Russians see that organisation encroaching ever closer to its border, naturally they are going to think, look, this is a bit disconcerting for us, in the same way, as I say, it would be for America if it was the other way around. But we don't think of that. And in the West, I don't think we ever look at how a situation is perceived by our so-called enemy. If we were to do what they're doing, or if they were to do what it is that we're doing, how would we react to that? And, you know, I think when it comes to other wars, we often call for peace. We often call for ceasefires. In this one, I think it's striking.
Do we? Where are those voices that are often calling for peace? Because all I ever seem to hear is people desperately trying to get involved and fare the strikes and all the rest of it.
No, I think not always, absolutely not always, but there are some cases where, you know, when India, Pakistan, for example, occasionally have their skirmishes over the Kashmir region, people are very quick to call for peace when they think they don't necessarily have a strategic interest. They haven't done in this, and what they've done is they've egged Ukraine on and on and on, and we're now in an absolute quagmire, and there doesn't seem any way out of it. And I think we have to take a certain amount of responsibility for that.
What do you make to it all at home? I can tell you now, you're quite divided. I'll just give you a flavour. Bernard says you would have to be the most gullible person in the room to believe anything at all that comes out of Putin's mouth. But Mac, however, he has a completely different view. He says, in summary, the West has Putin derangement syndrome. What do you make to that? Whose side are you on? Did you watch that interview? And what did you make to it? What did you think about Tucker Carlson, the way that he conducted that interview? A lot of people saying that he basically gave Putin too much of an easy ride. Did he or not? You tell me.